It is May 1945. The war in Europe is finally over, and the long-awaited peace has arrived. While soldiers and civilians celebrate VE Day, Prime Minister Winston Churchill harbors deep concerns about his communist ally, Joseph Stalin. 3 months prior, the Yalta Conference left Churchill wary of Soviet ambitions in Eastern Europe, especially in Poland. Determined to impose the will of the United States and Britain upon Stalin, Churchill convenes his top military strategists for a preemptive strike against the Soviet Union, dubbed Operation Unthinkable. Commencing on July 1st, 1945, the plan envisioned a surprise offensive using a two-pronged attack through Soviet-occupied Germany and Poland. This was to begin with a northern thrust advancing along the Axis from Stettin to Bydgoszcz, and a southern thrust from Leipzig to Breslau. From there, the Soviets were expected to capitulate. On May 24th, Churchill's strategists deliver this plan to the Chiefs of Staff Committee with much apprehension. What began as an overview of operations in the Pacific ends with a sobering presentation on Britain's plan to subdue the Soviet Union before it grows to threaten Western Europe. Field Marshal Sir Alan Brooke, the chairman of the committee, finds the plan to be most fantastical, with the odds of success just as unthinkable. Yet Brooke also recognizes an immense danger posed by the Soviets and reconsiders what the planners put forward. The following day, the committee reevaluates the plan, concluding that immediate action is required to protect Allied interests on the continent. Even with the formidable challenges and risks, a decisive strike is seen as necessary to curb Soviet expansion now before it's too late to stop them. Soon enough, Operation Unthinkable is given the go-ahead. Within days, the combined chiefs of staff for the Allies are given orders to begin mobilization and prepare staging points for the attack. The key objective for both the northern and southern thrusts is to stabilize a front from Danzig to Breslau before the winter months arrive and bog down the war effort. Even before the July deadline, Soviet forces under Marshal Georgy Zhukov were made aware of this activity thanks to scouting reports and infiltration inside British intelligence. Despite Stalin once again dismissing evidence from his own spy networks, Zhukov finds the reports of so many field armies on the move to be alarming. He orders Red Army forces occupying Poland to regroup into eastern Germany, anticipating a potential confrontation. On both sides, soldiers who had not long since celebrated the war's end now found anxiety gripping their ranks. On July 1st, the fateful order is given out. Allied armor and motorized divisions begin rolling out along their lines of attack. Skies fill with the din of British and American aircraft, and the Baltic swarms with flotillas of the Royal Navy. Upon hearing this news, Joseph Stalin is left speechless. First betrayed by Hitler, and now the Allies. What was unthinkable is now reality. Europe is once again at war, but the outcome is uncertain. We made a 45-minute uncensored documentary on the rise and fall of ISIS, ad-free, over on our platform, Armchair History TV. Watch it now on your phone or computer, as well as over 150 fully exclusive videos made by all different historical content creators. Use the code ONEYEAR for 63% off of your first year, which means that you can get the first 12 months of an Armchair History TV subscription for $19 right now. This is one of our biggest discounts ever, as we celebrate 1 year since our new platform was launched back in 2023. Since launching, AHTV now includes several Armchair Historian exclusive productions, like our videos on Mussolini's black shirts, Israel's modern military, India's annexation of Portuguese Goa, Gaddafi's Amazonian bodyguard, the Rwandan genocide, and much, much more. New exclusive content comes out every single week, And this is in addition to every single Armchair Historian video on YouTube, which are there ad-free and uncensored. We even have a few videos with uncut content, like our video on Soviet collaborators who helped the Nazis, which we couldn't show on YouTube. Thanks for all the support. Don't forget to use the code 1YEAR to get your first full year of AHTV for only $19. The first week of July sees initial success. In the north, armored divisions from the British Second Army punch through Soviet lines, while reinforcements from the Canadian First Army help sustain their momentum. After forcing the Soviet 65th Army out of Rostock, key road crossings and bridges are then secured on the way toward Stettin. In the south, US forces overwhelm Leipzig before advancing into Czech territory and tying up Soviet defenses around the city of Prague. In Dresden, elements of the Soviet 33rd and 13th Armies struggle to defend the bombed-out remains of the city against the US First Army. Overall, Allied commanders are in good spirits. However, momentum soon peters out as the battle-hardened Soviets stand their ground, entrenching themselves in defensive positions all across eastern Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Austria. British and American armored divisions soon find their advance thwarted by Soviet artillery, as the same cannons and rockets which pulverized the Nazis into submission now savage Allied tanks and infantry. Within days, Red Army reinforcements flood to the new fronts to stabilize the line, giving the Soviet High Command time to organize a counteroffensive. Despite all the devastating losses suffered during the Great Patriotic War, the Red Army is confident that its manpower reserves remain sufficient enough to bear the brunt of further offensives. The same cannot be said for the Allies. Before the end of July, tens of thousands of British, Canadian, and American soldiers have died. In a desperate move, the Allied High Command makes the fateful decision to reconscript and deploy German units against the Soviets. The process is as rushed as it is contentious. 10 German divisions were planned for deployment in the autumn. Instead, these German troops are pushed out into reconstituted divisions by early August, plagued with logistical issues and ethical quandaries. Chatter among British, American, and Polish volunteer troops reveal concerns about their new comrades. Many are disturbed at the thought of fighting alongside former Wehrmacht and even SS enemies. For the Germans pressed into service, the feeling is mutual. By the end of August, the Red Army has orchestrated a series of coordinated large-scale attacks that exploit weaknesses in the Allied front lines. In the north, Soviet troops recapture Rostock and push the British Second Army back toward Hamburg. The beleaguered Canadian First Army is forced to retreat in the face of relentless pressure from elite shock and guards formations, ordered by Zhukov to lead the Soviet counterattacks. Key road crossings and bridges previously secured by the Allies are lost, cutting off vital supply lines and forcing a strategic withdrawal. In the south, the situation is equally dire, as the US 1st, 3rd, and 7th Armies are also repelled. Soviet forces recapture Leipzig and press further into Allied-held territory, driving US forces back toward their staging points in Bavaria. The First Army's hard-fought gains in Dresden are lost as Soviet artillery and mechanized units overwhelm their positions. In late September, the front lines begin to stabilize, with neither side securing a decisive victory. The war devolves into a grueling conflict where artillery and air power assist in bloody but altogether sporadic offensives that result in little territorial gain. Prolonged conflict exacerbates the already severe war weariness on both sides. Allied populations, having just emerged from the Second World War, face the grim prospect of more rationing, more conscription, and more aerial bombings. This sparks anti-war demonstrations and demands for peace. The Soviet Union also faces immense strain, with economic hardships and continuous fighting eroding what little resolve their citizens have left. As the cold snows of December begin to appear, leaders on both sides pale at the thought of a winter campaign that would be sure to devolve into attritional warfare. Soon enough, diplomatic channels open up to enforce a ceasefire and bring end to active hostilities. By the end, most of Central and Eastern Europe is in ruins. Economic catastrophe grips both the Soviet Union and the Western Allies, leading to severe shortages and an unprecedented refugee crisis. Millions are displaced, and infrastructure lies in shambles. Eventually, an armistice is signed in early 1946, establishing a new but uneasy peace that enforces demilitarization zones all across the Iron Curtain. Mutual animosity lingers, setting the stage for a Cold War fraught with tension and distrust. Reports from the front are not good. Soviet defenses prevent any capture of key bridgeheads into their territory. With the ground war already faltering, the Allies remain focused on achieving air superiority. RAF and US bomber commands coordinate an overwhelming strategic air campaign as 2,500 heavy bombers pour over Soviet-occupied areas, targeting key military and industrial sites. The Soviet Air Force struggles to mount an effective defense. With Lend-Lease resources dried up, the Soviets are deprived of nearly half of their supplies of high-grade aviation spirit, imported rubber, aluminum, copper, and ferroalloys needed for production. At sea, the Royal Navy swiftly implements an effective blockade of the Soviet Navy in both the Baltic and Black Seas. Deploying a mixed complement of cruisers, destroyer flotillas, motor torpedo boats, and a naval assault force, the Allies are able to sustain maritime dominance. The blockade cripples Soviet naval operations and logistics, forcing the Red Army to rely solely on their ground forces to attempt a breakthrough. Confidence runs high among Allied naval commanders as Soviet vessels attempting to break out from northern Baltic ports or navigate through the Dardanelles are contained by Allied ships. Coupled with British progress at sea, the Americans introduce a new ace up their sleeve: atomic weapons. The successful Trinity test on July 16th confirms the devastating potential of these new bombs. At the same time, US President Truman and Prime Minister Churchill agree to deploy these bombs and compel a Soviet surrender before they can renew their neutrality pact with Japan, form an alliance against the Allies, or worse, gain their own bomb. It's a difficult choice, but both leaders believe that this will end the war swiftly and prevent further bloodshed. On the strategic air campaign, Allied escort fighters struggle against the sheer numbers of Soviet aircraft. To counter this, all available British, American, and even refurbished German jet planes are pressed into service. These aircraft provide the Allies with critical advantages in speed and maneuver, while their pilots gain valuable experience in jet fighter combat. However, design flaws and the small quantities of available jets leave the Allies relying on piston fighters as the main interceptors and escorts for their heavy bombers. Continuous pressure on Soviet infrastructure begins to weaken their air capabilities, giving the Allies a tenuous but crucial edge. By August, the Americans are ready to demonstrate their first two atomic weapons. On August 11th, the American B-29s deploy the first 15-kiloton bomb over the 1st Guards Tank Army positioned at Kummersdorf. The resulting explosion creates a 700-foot fireball, vaporizing everything at its core. Within the blast radius, all heavily built structures and Soviet positions are obliterated. Severe third-degree burns affect both soldiers and civilians for miles around. Windows shatter, and injuries are widespread nearly 3 miles from the epicenter. Not long after, acute radiation sickness begins to set in, with many succumbing to poisoning. In the following days, Zhukov scrambles to recover what's left of General Mikhail Katakov's army. Then, on August 15th, a second 20-kiloton bomb detonates over Königsberg. In mere seconds, one of the USSR's most valuable warm water ports is obliterated. Stunned by the unprecedented devastation and overwhelming casualties, Soviet leaders in the military and Kremlin urge the Politburo to make peace. Although Soviet intelligence was aware of the US's nuclear capabilities through espionage and prior warnings, the immediate and catastrophic impact of the atomic bombings forces a reassessment. Shaken by the imminent danger of a nuclear holocaust and unable to retaliate, Joseph Stalin is compelled to surrender. The immediate aftermath of the atomic bombings prompts a swift response. An armistice is declared, leading to intense negotiations. The resulting peace treaty mandates that Soviet forces withdraw from East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Austria, and much to Churchill's satisfaction, Poland. However, the newly sovereign and unified Germany expresses deep resentment over the use of atomic weapons on its soil. Similarly, Poland voices concerns about the proximity of the atomic attacks, fearing long-term health impacts. Kummersdorf and Königsberg are still reeling from the immense loss of life and catastrophic infrastructure damage. The fallout leaves many in ill health, with radiation sickness claiming the lives months after the initial explosions. The immediate humanitarian crisis is profound, requiring extensive international aid and long-term medical support. The global balance of power shifts dramatically. The United States and its allies gain significant influence in Eastern Europe and Asia, reshaping geopolitical dynamics. The accelerated development of nuclear weapons by both sides marks the early stages of a highly intensified Cold War. The world enters a new, more dangerous era, where the threat of nuclear conflict looms large, and the arms race escalates with unprecedented urgency. Despite progress in the Pacific, America's heavy investment of resources there leaves support for European operations stretched. While logistical efforts are underway to shift soldiers from Europe to the Pacific, the new conflict with the Soviets means that some troops destined for Japan are retained in Europe, leading to manpower issues in both theaters. Meanwhile, British intelligence remains compromised by groups like the Cambridge Five. Military information leaked to NKVD handlers is reluctantly passed on to the main intelligence directorate before Allied forces begin their surprise ground offensive on July 1st. With the Red Army on high alert, both the northern and southern forces struggle against entrenched Soviet divisions as waves of Red Army tanks, artillery, and infantry repel the Allies before they can even capture critical footholds. Hopes for a swift victory soon evaporate. Even with sanctions, naval blockades, and a devastating bombing campaign, Soviet high command remains confident as the Red Army steadily advances across Central Europe. Desperate Allied commanders order a strategic withdrawal to more defensible positions in Western Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Austria. The retreat is chaotic, with logistical nightmares compounding the already dire situation. Morale plummets, and by late July, constant pressure from Soviet offensives drive British and American forces behind the Elbe River. The successful Trinity test in July leaves Allied strategists deliberating over the use of atomic weapons. With two simultaneous wars against Japan and the USSR, many predict a catastrophic level of nuclear retaliation is needed to subdue both theaters. Consequently, President Truman decides against offensive bomb deployments, reserving them for an extreme defense scenario. Churchill is outraged, knowing British casualties in Europe will continue to soar, but the decision stands. The Allies must continue the fight through conventional means. On the diplomatic front, Japan and the Soviet Union renew their non-aggression pact in late August, vowing to stand up to imperialist and colonialist aggression. With their eastern borders secured, the Soviets redeploy some forces from the Far East to bolster their European front, despite the lingering threat of a US invasion. Soviet air forces in the Far East are also redirected to support operations in Europe. Simultaneously, Japanese forces in Manchuria focus on reinforcing their positions and maintaining control over occupied territories. This complicates Allied plans in the Pacific, as key objectives for the campaign are now postponed. September and October see further casualties on the European front, as Zhukov's divisions wear down Allied morale with extensive artillery barrages and bombing runs. By November, the Red Army's momentum appears unstoppable as they push Allied forces over the Weser and Odenwald rivers. Alongside British, Canadian, American, and Polish soldiers, many Wehrmacht and SS POWs pressed back into Allied service are also captured by the Red Army. With little time and less mercy from advancing Bolsheviks, many of these German prisoners not sent east are summarily executed. Severe logistical issues worsen conditions on both sides as the war drags on. The Allies struggle to maintain supply lines, with civilian populations suffering from shortages and heightened rationing. The Soviet Union also contends with the immense strain of sustaining a prolonged offensive while overextending their forces. Essential roads and railways are left unusable due to Allied bombing, severely disrupting efforts to resupply and reinforce their troops. As winter approaches, the harsh conditions exacerbate the already dire situation, pushing both sides to the brink. The onset of winter sees Soviet forces pushing the last Americans out of Austria, as they desperately flee to regroup with Allied forces in northern Italy. In western Germany, the Red Army halts its advance at the Rhine, fearing intervention from other Western powers along with the total collapse of their flagging supply network. The Allies concentrate all across the French borders, with both sides becoming entrenched and unable to secure a decisive victory. A cold and bitter static war sets in, with mass casualties on both sides of the Rhine over the following months. Overwhelmed and out of options, the Allies negotiate a ceasefire with terms heavily weighed against them. The Soviets, having reached the scope of what is tenable for victory, agree to end hostilities. The ceasefire marks the conclusion of a brutal and devastating conflict, but the consequences for Europe are far from over. The aftermath leaves Europe in ruins, with millions displaced and infrastructure shattered. The Soviets establish control over Western Germany and Austria, leading to significant geopolitical changes alongside the spread of communism. Japan exists in an uneasy peace with its Soviet adversaries, having barely survived the Pacific War and achieving a conditional surrender. The New World Order is defined by Soviet dominance in Europe and the Far East, with Western powers reeling from defeat. The Cold War takes on a new dimension, with the balance of power heavily tilted in favor of a growing red tide. Each potential outcome of Operation Unthinkable shares a similar theme: catastrophe. The devastating human toll, economic collapse, and geopolitical upheaval reveals that any victory would have come at an immeasurable cost. The historical decision to reject Operation Unthinkable was prudent, preventing further devastation in an already war-weary world. Churchill's and the Allied leaders' ultimate choice to avoid another conflict help preserve a fragile peace, allowing Europe to rebuild, and eventually leading to a relatively more stable Cold War. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to check out Armchair History TV for ad-free exclusive content, including over 150 exclusive videos from top historical creators. I'd also like to highlight the Front's videos on the No-Gun Remassacre and the Luftwaffe during D-Day, as well as Adventures in Historyland's videos on the Iroquois Confederacy and Spain in the American Revolution, and our biggest production ever, The Rise and Fall of ISIS. Access all of these now for a deep discount by using our code 1YEAR for just 63% off of your first year. That's just $19 for 12 whole months.